Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Dr. Victoria Carpenter from the University of Bedfordshire, UK. I
sorry, go ahead.
I spent the past 23 and a half years being everything from a lecturer in Spanish to the head of research development at the university. This is my third university, and I continue to carry out my research while looking after other people's research development and making sure that the research we do is ethically sound, done with good integrity, and helps people develop good research skills.
That's quite a responsibility.
Yeah, it grew out of my need to understand how I was doing research so that I could help my doctoral students to do research. And then I realized at some point that I could actually convert this understanding of how research is done into a set of principles that are generic for everybody. I mean, no matter whether you're researching medieval Spanish poetry or organic chemistry, the principles are the same. You're looking for something new. Then when you find the space where this newness might happen, you create it, hopefully, and then you spread the word. And so I spent quite a bit of time understanding the mechanisms behind it and created a training program, which is now the University of Bedfordshire, which is called very aptly Research and Development Training Program, where I teach people how to do research while doing research myself. So I'm of very strong opinion that a researcher cannot teach how to do research if they don't do research themselves.
And I must say it's a delight to hear you say that, because so many people in academia, as they rise through the ranks to become managers, give up on research. And I think it's wonderful that you're still doing it, apart from the quality of what you do, which is great. The very fact that you're doing it is inspirational and means that you're not just scolding people with a wagging finger from somewhere above and beyond, if I may say so.
Yes, it is a difficult thing to maintain your research profile while working in management. But when I first started my academic career, I found myself being removed from research for quite some time, for about a semester, while I was catching up on teaching new modules, creating new modules, catching up on new modules while I was creating new modules. And at some point, I realized that I was becoming a lump on a rock. I was no longer an academic. I was a very lowly form of information regurgitation for my students. And I thought, okay, if I see myself like this, how would the students who come to higher education to actually learn new things about new things, acquire new skills, and develop, first and foremost, academic curiosity about the world? How would they do it if I'm not doing it? So I started looking for ways to do it. And it took quite a bit of time management, quite a bit of ruthless planning, changing all kinds of things in the way I was doing stuff, introducing lots of different habits that I didn't have before, that I then passed on to my colleagues. So at my first university, we had the jeans approach to research, which was, if I'm wearing jeans and I'm in my office, I'm doing research. If I'm wearing formal outfits, so, formal, a suit or formal trousers and a blouse, then I'm teaching. And so on the days when I would do research, I'd tell my students, if you see me wearing jeans and a t-shirt or jeans and a sweater, I'm researching. If you come to my office asking me anything about how to use the subjunctive and clauses of unreal conditions, or how to conjugate, a root-changing verb, I will respond with a quote from my latest publication. And so my students would come in, look under the desk, see jeans, and walk away. My colleagues, on the other hand, didn't want to do that. They would ignore this rule, so they would come to me and say, "Oh, Victoria, since you're not doing anything," while I'm sitting there with a book in front of me, probably protecting myself from cosmic rays, and they'd say, well, you're not doing anything. Could you answer this question about some subject health thing? And I'd say, no, I'm researching. I'm wearing jeans. So you're going to have to listen to, you know, diffused power distribution in the post-hegemonic sphere for your sins. And as I was leaving my first university, quite a few people picked up this thing about wearing jeans. So if you're in the office and you're wearing jeans, you're researching. And that was one of the sort of the triggers for what I now do at my university, which is research retreats. So following Rowena Murray's structured research retreat style of retreats, I take people away to a hotel for a couple of days, usually 2 days, 1 night, where we work in just on research. Nobody is allowed to touch their email unless they're co-writing with somebody who is on email. And this approach to research, to sort of understanding that research is not a sort of leisurely activity. It's not something that you can do in between other things. You do it as it's a commitment. You commit yourself to doing research on a particular day. And it's a whole lot harder to carry out a research activity than it is to, say, deliver a lecture. I can lecture on the history of the liberal-conservative divide in Spain in my sleep, but I can't research in my sleep. Nothing good will come out of researching in my sleep. So, and also getting research into your classroom helps students to see that we're not just, people who write these books that they read and all these, articles that we read, they're not somebody sort of out there somewhere. They're just like us. Right? And when I bring my research to my students and say, here, read this is really cool, they see me as, hey, she creates this research, and that's what higher education is supposed to be doing. Unfortunately, when further up the management ladder you go, the harder it gets. But there are quite a few people in my position or higher than my position who do that, who still hold on to their research because that's what identifies us. That's who I am. I am the Tlatelolco woman. I am the hurricane woman. I'm the first person narrative woman. But that's who I am. I'm not the person who answers emails.
I wonder if I could pick up on some of those adjectives before the word woman you just used, and maybe
Please.
start with the hurricane woman, which sounds intimidating. I mean, do you stand there in a blouse or in a t-shirt and force them back, or do you welcome them on?
I wait until they pass, and then I show up. So the project that I'm working on at the moment is about how people affected by hurricanes and government agencies tasked with hurricane recovery projects negotiate the period of recovery. And
You're muted, Prof.
Am I?
You're back now.
Oh, okay.
So the last I heard was you talk to people who've survived hurricanes and also government agencies who have the task of fixing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's people affected by hurricanes and government agencies tasked with hurricane recovery projects and negotiate the period of recovery. The problem when it presented itself was kind of a very strange problem. So when a hurricane hits, the immediate response is unified. So everybody works together. Everybody mucks in. You have the disaster management coordinators coming to the settlements, the villages, and they, see what happened and help people out, and everybody works together. And then something happens, and they stop. And they turn this collaborative space into a space of conflict. Now, based on my previous work that I've done on the massacre in the Tlatelolco district of Mexico City on the 2nd of October, 1968, I had a similar situation where I had two sides narrating an event, a violent event, a contentious event. And the way they narrated it was very much informed by the emotions associated with the initial hit of that event. So the next morning after the massacre, the headlines splashed across the newspapers are, a thing happened. So many dead, so many wounded, so many, etc. And that gave rise to a project that I spent about 7 years doing. I literally lived in that square for 7 years on my mind. And I analyzed pretty much every text I could lay my hands on that was published in Mexico between the 3rd of October 1968 and the 31st of December 1976. And the reason for the 31st of December is because Luis Echeverria, who was the Secretary of Internal Affairs, I believe, under Gustavo Díaz Ordaz's presidency in 1968, and who is deemed to be directly responsible for sending the troops into the Square of the Three Cultures, where the demonstration was, student demonstration was held and then was shot at. He became president in 1970, and then he's carried out his presidency till 1976. And so I thought that it would be a good idea to include his presidency in that spread of texts. And I read several hundred texts. I analyzed them. It took 7 years. It became personal at some point. I really needed to get the answer, not to what happened and who's responsible, because we know and we don't know. We know from the archives that it was ordered, that it wasn't just, the army showed up for no particular reason in the square to hear what the students have to say. But will we know exactly how many people died? Probably not. Do we need to? That's the question that I asked myself, because all the texts that I was reading, every single one of them presented different information. Some texts said 200 were killed, 500 were killed. John Rodda's reports of 274, Octavio Paz's view that this is about the right number. Juan Miguel de Mora, in the book published in 1973, said 5,000 people were killed. I think Salvador Hernandez said 15,000. Now, I've been to the square, 15,000 people dead. That square would be, piled up high. So that probably is a bit of an insane proposition, but the problem remained the same, that there was no single fixed objective account. This is what happened at this time. This happened, that the helicopter flew, the flares were set off, etc. And as I was analyzing these texts, I found something quite peculiar. I found that there was the language that was used to deliver this information incited emotions, particular set of emotions, anger, grief, and shame, in that order repeatedly, over and over again. The texts that incited those emotions were then taken by other texts as telling the truth. So the text following these texts would say, and here's the truth. Boom, information from the texts with that emotional triangle encoded in them. And so as I was progressing through the study, I realized that what we got when the texts would say what happened was more, how did we feel when it happened? And with that came the idea that as when catastrophic, dramatic, traumatic, and violent events happen, we don't remember facts, we remember the feelings. And one of the key things about it was actually triggered by my students. I was preparing a lecture on the absent text. And I thought, well, I'll take Tlatelolco as an example. This would be, really, really good. So I pulled up the image of the monument in the Square of the Three Cultures where the massacre happened. And the monument is there with the names of the dead. And it says the names of our compañeros who fell here on the 2nd of October, 1968. And there were 20 names. I'm not a quantitative researcher. I don't do statistics, but I thought, you know what, I'll just count the names and see, how many women, how many men, what the age spread, etc. And there were 20 names. And then it said, and many more whose names we still don't know. Now, the stela was erected in 1983, and 15 years after the massacre. On the 3rd of October, in El Excelsior, which is the largest daily newspaper in Mexico City, the front page headline was 20 dead, 75 wounded, 400 plus arrested. The next day, the number was amended to 33, I believe, and then the day after that to 36. The list of names, the 36 or the 39 names, was published in El Excelsior, El Universal. But there were 20 names on the monument. And the list, I mean, I could find this list. If I could find a list in the newspaper, surely the families of the disappeared and the dead would have had those names. One name was written in by hand, which was also a peculiar thing. But this list of names was just 20. And I thought, well, why 20? What is this 20? I remember seeing number 20. I went through every single piece of text I could find in my folders, and I found it. It was that headline in El Excelsior. The article that followed the headline, called Recio Combate, or Fierce Fighting, was the article that was used by all the public texts afterwards, including Elena Poniatowska, including Ramon Ramirez, Orlando Ortiz, loads of them, Juan Miguel de Mora. So that was when I first realized that this is where emotions stepped in front of facts. And as I was finishing this study and hoping to get it out before the 2nd of October 2018, to commemorate the 50th anniversary, I got involved in a networking project funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund. And it was on risk and resilience in response to natural disasters in the Caribbean. And so I thought, natural disasters, violent events, catastrophic events, things that change the course of living. Now, I've lived in Florida for quite a few years, and I'm no stranger to hurricanes and tropical storms. And I know that on the 30th of April, everybody gets their can openers, their flashlights, their batteries, their tinned food and everything else ready. And so I was in that same mode. And there were a couple of close calls with hurricanes. So I know hurricanes are, not very pleasant. So I thought, what I've got in terms of the methodology, the theoretical package from my study of the massacre, I can convert into the study of a hurricane. And this fallout after the initial effect of the hurricane, after that initial whoomp, when, things go flying, drew my attention because I already knew what happened at the point of that whoomp. What happens afterwards? What happens when everybody just kind of cools down and the emotions stop running riot? What happens then? And what happens then is what my project is uncovering now. And that was the step. I mean, I thought, well, I've done massacre for 7 years, and I'm kind of, honestly, I need to walk away from it. It's a bit too much. And I've said what I needed to say. I can say more now, but at that point, that was all I wanted to say. And so I moved on to hurricanes in Jamaica, just, a logical progression.
And of course, the term natural disaster is always very complex to use when it comes to natural phenomena that are themselves often distorted by climate change, as it were, or altered, but also living patterns that make for a huge difference. So in a place like Florida, although, as you say, there are these extraordinary weather events, they're nothing compared to what was probably happening 250, 300 years ago. There's some evidence that in terms of historic cycles, quite apart from human-made climate change, the big population shift in the United States towards Florida happened to come at a point of relative peace climatically. And that in addition to human-made climate change, there is evidence that we could be re-entering a cycle that is in and of itself more destructive. So I think it is very interesting to ponder this tendency, which, as you know, applies to half the world's population now, which is on the one hand to move to cities and on the other to move to coasts.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And of course, a place like Mexico City that you were referring to, most of it built on a lake. So it's no wonder that in a place that has extraordinarily, shall we say, lively earthquake activity, there isn't much to hold on to, as it were, unless you happen to be in one of the sort of rocky outcrops, which
Yes, of course, yes. And not just on the lake, it's not just the lake, but it's also the surrounding volcanic range.
Yeah.
That, adds sort of spice to life in addition to, yeah.
Elena Poniatowska, of course, her brother died in Tlatelolco, but she also wrote very movingly about the 85 earthquake, where again, there are huge disparities about the number of people who died. But we're also thought mythically regarded in Mexico, as you know, as the beginning of civil society and as the moment of the beginning of the decline of the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI, because the government did, to use technical language, fucking nothing, by contrast with ordinary people helping one another. So, that was, and of course, there was also the other side. You've talked about how there's cooperation, but also conflict, because there was also looting and assault and so on, right?
Yes. Yes. It's sort of the natural disasters tend to bring out the best and the worst out of people.
So can I ask you, with Tlatelolco, you were using some archival sources and also observation and discussion, right?
Yeah, I mean, my sources needed to be to have been publicly available when they were published. So because my view was that I need to understand how the public received that information, because from the public came quote unquote public texts or non-government publications, studies, academic pieces, political essays, testimonials, novels, poetry, etc. And that's something I tried steering away from, using archives, because they wouldn't have been accessible to people at the time. So it's all based on just public texts, publicly available texts. Yeah.
No, sorry. When I said archival, I didn't actually. I can see the confusion. I wasn't referring to going into archives. I meant historical material, let's say.
Yeah.
And of course, there is an entire poetry of Tlatelolco.
Oh, yes.
And I wondered if
literature.
I could ask you a little bit about that, but also whether there is a literature of hurricanes with which I'm not familiar.
Yeah, there is not as extensive in some areas. I mean, one of the sources of sort of the big contribution to literature was Hurricane Mitch. And that was in Nicaragua. There was a whole slew of poetry written about Mitch. And of course, Mitch had a massive impact on Central America, Honduras and Nicaragua in particular, with the impact on Nicaragua being, quite preventable had President Alemán actually listened to the mayor of Pozoltega and ordered a mandatory evacuation of the region, which he didn't, said, oh, no, it's fine. And then the Casita volcano had a landslide, which was a lahar, that buried 2 villages and killed about 2,500 people. So that was not so much the hurricane damage, but it was the aftermath, which was exacerbated by the fact that the slopes of the volcano were pretty much, plowed dry. They were deforested, so there was no way to prevent, or at least to slow down the lahar. So it went at quite a clip, at about 40 miles an hour, and you can't outrun that. So, Honduras did actually bear the brunt of the impact of Mitch, and the fact that Mitch slowed down on impact and just sat upon the country for 5 days. A category 4 to 5 hurricane stalling for 5 days, I can tell you, it was it was total destruction. Kind of like what Hurricane Maria did to Dominica in 2017, just raise the topsoil of the island. So it's um the I'm surprised there isn't much more literature in relation to hurricanes in Latin America. But at the same time, I'm not, because not to put a finer point on it, but the region's dealing with a lot of stuff anyway in terms of like political upheaval. So yet another upheaval doesn't really stand out as much as it would in other areas where this kind of upheavals are not as prevalent. But there is, the Tlatelolco literature is extensive. It's extensive. Not just fiction, not just poetry, but also the Tlatelolco narrative. So testimonials. Works like semi-testimonials, like Luis González de Alba's Days and Years, Los Días o los Años, and then Otros Días, Otros Años, which he published in 2004. So there's more of that. I think it's because the political hurricanes that hit Latin America are frequent and long-lasting, and they don't just leave. They don't just go and then you get a chance to recover. They come back.
It's interesting in terms of that febrile year, 1968, which for many people conjures up Paris, Berkeley, Prague. But here, it's Tlatelolco.
It is.
In similar fashion, 1968 in the Olympics, because this took place just 10 days prior to the beginning of the games, it's not just and not so much about Vera Czaslavska or Tommy Smith or John Carlos and protests against the Soviet Union and against the United States and racism. It's, let's say, hundreds of people being massacred just in Tlatelolco Square.
Mm-hmm.
But it also marks for some people the beginning of the dirty war here, in terms of at least 1,000 people after that event being disappeared,
mm-hmm.
murdered in different ways, and so on. And I guess that's one of the reasons why it produces so much literature, so much memory, so many documentaries, because, as you say, it's contested terrain, but it's also an epic moment in popular history of students and workers and bystanders being slaughtered.
Yeah, it's also beggars belief that 10 days before the Olympic Games happens, in the country that calls itself haven of democracy, in the political climate that wasn't all that volatile compared to other countries, you have this absolutely disproportionate response to a student demonstration, with after all the statements by Diaz Ordaz about here's my outstretched hand, and the response to that is, let's do a gunpowder test on that hand. As I really like that. I think that's very, very apt. But with Mexico, and especially with PRI, the facelessness, I think, of the multiple presidencies led to this institutional dictatorship, where the party is associated with the dictatorship rather than, like Trujillo, or you have, Pinochet, or you have, and the name has completely left my mind, but similar events in other Latin American countries, you have these personified, this individualized almost dictatorship, whereas in Mexico, it's not really a dictatorship. But it is. But it's not. There's a brilliant book by René Vélez Fabile, El Gran Solitario del Palacio, the great loner of the palace. Oh, it's about a nameless president who is one of many nameless presidents, and he's just known as the president. And he has a wife who's known as the lady. And they're just these faceless entities. It's a very funny book. It's political satire at its best. But it is a very accurate description of institutional dictatorship, which is what pretty was, regardless of all the rhetoric and such. The fact that you had the railroad trade union members jailed for 8 to 10 years for no particular reason. The whole response to the student movement, the occupation of the university campuses by the army, it all points to the same thing. It is a dictatorship, but it's not associated with a single person. Well, once this one leaves, it'll be fine. No, it won't.
It comes along. And also, I guess, like Colombia, perhaps in numerical terms, the two most violent countries in Latin America, unlike everywhere else, they kept having bloody elections. Now, they were corrupt, 100%, but they were elections. They were formally democracies.
Yes.
This makes it hard for people from the global north, accustomed to categories that dissociate generally democracy from intense authoritarianism, to deal with this. But there it is. And Prof, I wanted to ask you also, if we can get back to the poetry and the literature themselves, what do you see as the sort of key characteristics associated with Tlatelolco or with chaotic events of intense crisis and suffering?
I think it's this very close-knit relationship between the knowledge archive of the event and the emotions that envelop it. So if we were to look at the literature, Tlatelolco literature, and especially Tlatelolco poetry, there are a number of images, sort of archetypal almost images, that happen again and again. It's the shoes left in the square when people were running for their lives. It's the flares set off in the square. It's the clicking of the soldiers' boots on the pavement, shattered windows, screaming children, terrified families. And these images, they focus your attention on the most emotionally charged parts of the event. And they're like these flashes, these pictures that happen. When 9/11 happened, I worked in an international studies center down south in Polegate, and I was teaching a Spanish class, and I got called out by the head of the center saying, there's this thing happening. And I remember, now this has been almost 24 years. I remember the images of that day much better than I remember the actual what happened in what order. I remember one of my students was crying in my office because we couldn't get hold of their parents. I remember that somebody broke a cup in the cafeteria. They dropped a mug. I remember being on the train the next day and everybody being just absolutely, totally quiet, and the newspapers. And on the newspapers, the image of the Twin Towers with a plume of smoke between them. But I cannot, if I have to piece them together, what happened after which event, I wouldn't be able to place it. I just have these images. And so when I was analyzing the fiction, the literary representation of Tlatelolco, I was very aware of these very visual and very auditory kind of content. There is a poem, if I could just quickly find it. It's just going to take me a moment.
No rush. We've been waiting 57 years to understand the phenomenon. We can wait a moment or two more.
So this is a poem, and I will, yeah, okay. So this is a poem by Oscar Oliva, published in 1972. I don't know when it was written, but it's published in 1972. And the poem is quite brief. It's prefaced by the quotation of several key statements from Marcelino Garcia Barragan's press conference. So this was he was the General Secretary of National Defense, and the press conference was given a few hours after the massacre in the Square of the Three Cultures in Tlatelolco. So I will translate the poem. The official responsible is me. We will not declare state of emergency. Mexico is a country where freedom rules and will rule forever. And then we have the actual poem. The helicopters have launched flares, open eyes suspended in the air. Following the eyes, I watch the flares fall. What is this roar, this sound of many waters? The advance of soldiers is preceded by the clicking of the boot heels on the pavement. I'm one of the first ones to fall. That's the poem. On the 3rd of October 1968, in the article Fierce Fighting in Tlatelolco, we read the following quote. Suddenly, 3 flares appeared in the sky. They fell slowly. The demonstrators directed almost automatically their eyes up. They sort of looked up almost automatically. And when they started asking what this meant, they heard the advance of the soldiers. Their fast pace was preceded by the clicking of heels of their boots on the pavement. There are 4 years between those two statements, the poem and the text. Now, the piece from the article appears on page 13. It's a tiny little paragraph. It's 2 sentences. But that particular piece appears in a poem 4 years later. It's not as prominently placed as the title of the headlines of the newspapers. It's on page 13. It's quite buried in sort of the information, but the clicking of the boots, another quote about shattered windows, and behind the windows families terrified, petrified with fear, shielding their children. That's another image that appears in the texts in 1973. That's Juan Miguel de Mora, Tlatelolco, The Whole Truth. It appears, I believe, in Orlando Ortiz's Violence in Tlatelolco. It appears across the multiple texts, again, page 13, 14 in a daily newspaper. So there must have been something in that text that triggered that memory, that was so impressive. What's impressive? It's the sound and the image. And that becomes that knowledge archive that I talked about. So the knowledge archive is then cemented into the emotional packaging. So if we read about the clicking of the boots, the emotion that is triggered is going to be X. And so that's when I was analyzing, and I come up with this list of images that happened again and again and again in a variety of texts. Whenever those images were presented with the accompanying language of anger, grief, and shame, those images were seen as telling the truth about what happened. So in de Mora's text, it's particularly evident where he says, now I will tell you the whole truth of what happened. 5 years later. He doesn't. He delivers yet another fictional account, and that fictional account is built around the same imagery. The same imagery also appears in other texts. Oh, Socrates Campus Limus comes to mind with the revolution, the Autumn Revolution. He also has the image of shoes in the square, crying children. But his text is almost always rejected as lying because it doesn't contain the same emotions. The texts that incite hope in the Tlatelolco corpus are also seen as lying, even though they present exactly the same information as the texts inciting anger, grief, and shame. And so from that came the proposition that when we remember, quote unquote, sort of catastrophic events, especially when they're violent events, man-made events, the emotions associated with those events are going to be negative and are going to be sort of no resolution kind of emotions. I am now thinking about bringing in the emotion of hope, because it does exist in some texts, but those texts, like I said, are rejected. They're almost blacklisted. Well, Louis Spota is one of them. Even though there is the hope dies in that book, it's at the square, La Plaza. That is a very contentious book, in that it considers what would happen if we were indeed to find those responsible, and how the what the actions would be by the people who suffered as a result of the massacre, losing their loved ones, losing their family, etc. So that's where we stand. But I have noticed, I haven't done work on it, but I have sort of noticed in passing, looking at the way the Grenfell disaster, for example, was narrated, and I did a very brief look at the BBC coverage. The way the Ukrainian war is being narrated as well, the initial attacks, the anger, grief, and shame persists. So will I go and do a study of multiple violent events and look at what is happening? Will I take that, elsewhere in Latin America, another event in Latin America, perhaps in Mexico, perhaps the Corpus Christi massacre? I don't know, but there is a sense that, yes, the emotions are there. How do we get out of it? How do we just keep blaming people, probably to the detriment of healing? Can we heal? Is there an emotional framework that would help us heal after something like that? I think there is. The study, the recovery after hurricanes that I'm currently doing, is suggesting that there is that framework, and that framework is of stability. So where we have the turmoil of emotions, there is something else that tempers them, that allows us to not so much get used to them, but find a way to convert them into something positive. And so stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
I'm on the verge.
Prof, I had one more question for you, if I may.
Sure.
After that, I'd like to give you the opportunity, should you so wish, to subtract anything from what we've said, or add anything to what we've said, and that might involve taking a tack to another topic or going back to something we've touched on. So my last question is to ask you about two thorny words that stalk my response to much of what you've been outlining for us, and the words are vengeance and justice. And I wondered if you could give us a sense of how those words can be managed, the emotion of vengeance, the desire for justice can be dealt with.
Yeah. Yes. I think this is where I am currently heading with my study of hurricanes and this factor of stability. in the novel La Plaza by Luis Spota, there is at the end of the novel, the group called Days of the Week is deciding the fate of the retired president who they captured. It's Diaz Ordaz, of course, and they decide on what to do with him. So there are 7 of them. All 7 lost somebody in the square. So one lost his wife and a baby son. Somebody lost a son. Somebody lost a husband. The main character, Domingo, lost his daughter. And so they're discussing what they're going to do. 3 of them say, kill him, because he killed our lives and we want vengeance. 3 of them say, let him go. One says, I've got a new wife, I've got a child, my life is good. I will never forget my other family, but I need to move on. A woman who lost her son in the square says, no, let him live, and let him live with the guilt every day until it eats him alive. And another person says, I just want to put everything behind me and move on with my life. I lost everything. I cannot lose myself as a result of this, because, get arrested, get jailed, etc. The 3 who want vengeance because they want to pay, this person to pay for what he did. And the 7th person, Domingo, is undecided. And then one of the people who want vengeance takes Domingo's hand with a gun in it and shoots the president. And so next day they dump the body in a black refuse sack in the square and leave a note saying, and many more will come. That's the end of the novel. Whether many more come or not, we don't know. But what we do know is that it's not as cut and dry as, yes, vengeance is the only answer, or no, we need to move on. There needs to be some form of cathartic reconciliation, if you take Paul Ricoeur's view of that. But it's hard, mainly because of this very disparate emotional landscape that populates the space of recovery. It's not just negative emotions, and it's not just positive emotions. It's not just turmoil of emotions. It's not just stability. It's everything together. The space that I see is potentially open to recovery, to not so much justice, but reconciliation, is in that combination of shared emotions that are acknowledged on both sides with the same language, the combination of the turmoil of emotions and the stability of balance and empathy, and the you factor. So the you factor is just that. When the text develops you in it, whether it's in the form of usted, or tú, or ustedes, or vosotros, but there's a you somewhere, then there is potential for reconciliation of both sides, because it's an opening of a dialogue. I think the dialogue with Pri is impossible, because unless it's reformed, and by I don't mean reformed, but reformed, recreated, it's so entrenched in its narrative and in its discourse that it would be very difficult to do without putting this discourse through all of the pain that it caused. And that, of course, then the question is that an ethical thing to do? Is the ethics of justice, does the ethics of justice include the ethics of vengeance? Well, what is justice to people? Is it reconciliation? Is it vengeance? Or is it just that, objective facts? These people are responsible, and that's how we take it forward. Of course, the majority of those people are dead. Garcia Barragan is dead. This Ordaz is dead. I think Echeverria is dead. On the other side, most of the members of the National Strike Council, the core group, they're dead. González de Alba is dead. Álvarez Garín is dead. I'm not sure if Marcelina Perejó is dead or not. I can't remember off the top of my head, but Domínguez Aragonés, I think, is also dead. So the majority of them are gone. Or if they're not gone, they're in, in their 80s. Are we doing it for them, or are we doing it for ourselves? If we're doing it for ourselves, perhaps we should rethink what we need out of it. Do we need never again? Probably. Do we need an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? Probably not. So, but the space for reconciliation, I think, lies in unified language of shared emotions, where turmoil and stability and emotions and knowledge exchange exist in an equilibrium. And that's what I'm currently working on, is developing that framework of equilibrium and what we do with it. How do we teach it?
And are there any things you'd like to add as our means of concluding today?
I think, if anything, the project, the Tlatelolco project, has taught me that you can't take things for granted. You can't just look at this monument and say, of course, these are the names we know and no other names are known. We can't read Rosario Castellanos' poem Memorial de Tlatelolco and agree that the next day the newspapers had weather forecast as the main news of the day. Go and check for yourself and then see, why do we hold on to these statements as what really happened? Probably because the easiest response is to have an enemy construct and to throw all the blame at it. But that's a response, and that's a valid response, but it's not a research response. And so a research response is critical and reflexive and reflective. And it's not about whitewashing anybody's memory, nor is it about creating an enemy, out of whoever. It's not about laying blame. It's about understanding thoroughly what the mechanisms are behind different narratives. And can those mechanisms then be used to prevent something similar from happening before it actually happens? Because you can pretty much trace the rising of the wave through the texts. That it can be stopped, then we're come a long way to resolving the internal social conflicts that eventually lead to massacres like this. So I think that's all I've got to say.
Victoria Carpenter, thank you so much, Doctor, for being so generous with your time, your insights, your thoughts, and so on. I feel as though I've learned a lot, and I look forward to further engagement with your outstanding body of work.
Thank you very much, Toby. It was a pleasure.